Moral education is a subject which has increasingly of late been of explicit concern to educators, and in many people's minds, moral education is closely associated with religious education. With us today, we have Professor Donald Cochrane, whose home is normally in California, California State University at Northridge. But for the last couple of years, he's been teaching at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. To assist us in exploring the topic of religion and morality, we have Professor Rumulo Magsino of the Department of Educational Foundations here at Memorial, and Professor Noel Shuell of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. I think perhaps Rumulo is going to start off the discussion by attempting to clarify the relationship between the two concepts involved, morality and religion.
Yes, since our topic is related to morality and education and religion, you might just as well be clear about these concepts. What do you think is religion and what is morality, and how would you distinguish one from the other?
Let me begin by telling you a story from my teaching career. You and I both have subscribed to some extent or other to Paul Hurst's forms of knowledge or forms of understanding. One time in an undergraduate course I was setting out the 7 forms, or is it 6, and one of my students asked how I could possibly distinguish between moral understanding and religious understanding. Weren't the two identical? And there are times when you give a glib answer for pedagogical effect. And so I sort of shrugged my shoulders as if to say, well, that's rather straightforward. And the answer I gave was that religion is a form of understanding that tries to make some sense out of life given that death is inevitable. And given that it seems to be a widely held view that if death is inevitable, life must be meaningless. And by contrast, moral understanding had to do with how to conduct oneself while one was here, whether or not one took the view that God is dead or alive, whether or not life is meaningful or meaningless. So in a way, I would take the view that not all things are possible if God is dead, that Dostoevsky was simply wrong. Well, I left the answer in that way and went on to other things. The student phoned me 2 days later to report that he was going into hospital for an operation for a cancerous tumor on the brain, and that he thought that the answer had been a powerful answer. He wanted to know whether or not I would still stand by the answer in this light, whether or not it was, in fact, a glib response in a class or something to which I would subscribe. I held that I did subscribe to it, that I think that those are the two beginning points or purposes of those two forms of understanding. I might say that I spent that Monday afternoon in the hospital, in the waiting room as well, I think out of moral obligation to one of my students. Anyway, that's how I would begin the difference. Religion having to do with the meaningfulness of life in some kind of cosmic framework, morality having to do with proper conduct, no matter how we decide that the issues in religion, negatively or positively.
This definition is based on the differences of purpose for the two. The question is, would there be any more difference with reference to how it's done, or with reference to practice in life, so to say?
Well, it's conceivable that all the actions that one might perform as a result of one's religious teachings might be in accordance with, in fact, identical actions with those that you might prescribe for yourself. Prescribed for yourself already begins to give away a sort of Kantian basis for it. On the basis of principles like respect for persons, there need be no conflict. Certainly in practice there need be no conflict. But I take it that the kind of justification that you would give for your act might well be different in the two cases. And one could imagine things like, why did you do some X, visit your aunt in hospital? Don't you understand the teachings of my faith? That sort of thing. That would be the justification. If the teachings were different, one's performance might be different. On the other hand, a person who may be outside of some kind of religious framework might reply, don't you understand that the reason why I'm visiting my aunt in the hospital is that she's a person? We have responsibilities to people who are in suffering. Alleviating suffering is connected with consideration of people's interests, and that's a moral principle. One has prima facie obligations under what I call second-order principles. That's why I'm visiting my aunt in the hospital. So the justifications could be different.
Just picking up on that example, and if the response of the person were, well, I'm visiting my aunt in the hospital because she has a great deal of money,
Yes.
and I wish to inherit it, are we still in the realm of moral values, or have we shifted? In other words, it's an attempt to make meaning of life, and what to do, how to conduct one's life. But now there seem to be quite different considerations than respect for person, for example.
Let me just be sure that I'm clear about your example. The person in question, the meaning of that person's life is in self-aggrandizement of some kind, I take it. Then the question is whether or not that does or does not fall within some sort of religious conception of life. I mean, you have to imagine, I take it, a religion in which self-interest was, and indeed in the United States there seem to be some such sects. Reverend Ike, for example, who appears nationally on television, preaches prosperity and self-interest, a particular low level of entrepreneurial religious capitalism, one might so label it. Well, I don't want to judge that. I mean, it then becomes possibly a conventional definition of religion, that religions always contain sort of other regarding references. But with respect to morality, at least as I understand it, given that I hold, for reasons that would be a very long story, that respect for persons is the fundamental principle underlying what we could possibly mean by the moral point of view, and given that I hold that respect for persons is both an other-regarding as well as, and equally, a self-regarding principle, then a so-called morality based on self-aggrandizement would fall outside the purview of, I take it, a rational morality.
Now, are you saying then that in the quest to decide what to do in life, there are other values involved than moral values? Or are all values in life moral values?
You've raised an old chestnut, and one that some of us at Simon Fraser have been wrestling with, I'm not sure how successfully in the past 2 months. Whether or not the conception of morality is a limited conception, concerned simply with right and wrong conduct, good and bad motive, a sort of Kantian view, and whether or not the notion of morality should be expanded to include something that might be called ideals for life, rather substantive sorts of things towards which one might be said to be marching or ought to be marching. I'm not sure how to decide that. I know that my own scheme is concerned only with the former, with questions of conduct, not with questions of meaning. I mean, I take it that there's a kind of secular view of the meaningful life that's involved in this middle category that's often taken up in the area called values education. I take it that's the sort of thing that Clive Beck is frequently concerned about in his programs in Ontario. The development of sound values and ideals for living. And that seems to me to put a whole lot more flesh on the bones than I'm prepared to make. Perhaps it's just from lack of investigation. I might say parenthetically that I find Clive's, that somehow I feel attracted to the impulse, and yet I find his own work in the area inordinately vague, and for that reason unsatisfactory. But both of these approaches have very respectable antecedents in the history of philosophy, and going right back to Plato and Aristotle, and coming through Kant and a whole host of other philosophers who were at least in part concerned with morality. I haven't answered your question. I simply hope that I've indicated there's a Y in the road, and
Could you express it perhaps in terms of the question of whether an irreligious person would have a fundamental problem in articulating a moral position?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. And then immediately I begin to think of an exception. I'd like to make a distinction between what I call rather loosely a fundamental religious impulse, which might be expressed in terms like Schweitzer's reverence for life or a Tillich view of ultimate commitment or ultimate concern. And then the codification of that religious impulse that is expressed in various denominations. Let's just suppose that varieties of denominations or religions all have their wellspring in some similar kind of impulse. Let's just, for the sake of keeping it simple, say they're all within the Christian tradition. The different denominations, though, bring with them different moralities. That is, when you come to the level of specific behavior or kinds of behavior, different denominations of Seventh-day Adventists might differ from Roman Catholics, who in turn might differ from those in the United Church and from those in the Anglican Church and so on. Now, we could say then that different religions or denominations incorporate a specific morality, and I take it that in schools in Newfoundland they attempt through the denominational school system to inculcate those specific moralities. Now, I'm arguing, or would and do argue, for moral education that is both non-denominational and possibly non-theistic. That is, it's not a necessary condition of being a moral person that one have a theistic view towards the universe. But it may just very well be that the bottom line, psychologically, and I don't mean to say that in a slight sense, that the bottom lines are similar. That is, that one must have some general concern, positively, for persons, oneself included, to be a moral being. And now that's, I think, where the connection between morality as a rational enterprise and religion as another sort of enterprise, this is where they may well meet.
Would this be what was particularly radical or challenging about Kohlberg's work, in that if you view moral education in terms of developing a long set of psychological steps such that one can be said to be more mature at the later step, one would have completely eliminated any need of a reference to religious concerns or concerns which looked like religious concerns?
Well, indeed, that's part of the attraction, particularly in the United States, and then, as some people say out here, part of the attraction in Ontario, seemed to be the place where so much sewage seeps into the Canadian system. That might be caricaturing remarks that I've heard here rather severely. But certainly that was the attraction in the United States, which has gone about trying to solve the question of pluralism differently, say, from what I understand is the case in Newfoundland. You set up a common public school system rather than a denominational public school system, and then you have to find some kind of basis for the transmission of values that don't deny the peculiarities of the denominational inheritance of various of your students. Indeed, he's written an article on just this kind of point, trying to demonstrate that the cognitive developmental point of view overcomes various kinds of sectarian difference, and also overcomes the problems of indoctrination. I was careful to say, though it may raise some fire, that inculcation may very well be the model of transmission that might be encouraged in denominational schools. Certainly it was in the province of Quebec when I myself was a student in a denominational system. Well, this is, I think, Kohlberg's attraction. There are, of course, serious problems with the stage 6 end point in the developmental scheme. In philosophical terms, it has to do with the primacy of justice. That's as distinct from respect for persons. There are what are regarded as Lockean liberal underpinnings for such a system that have come under radical criticism. I mean, criticism from radicals of late. Well, there are other kinds of objections too. For example, is it cognitive to the detriment of other rather important elements of the morally autonomous agent? Does this neglect, and would the developmental scheme that he would implement in schools neglect other rather important components that also would need to be nurtured? So there are certainly very serious problems with Coburg, but I think you have put your finger on what's seen by so many to be attractive. I suppose the final thing is that he doesn't have to refer to any kind of theistic system and tries to eschew any discussion of worldview. He relies strictly on John Rawls to do his arguing for him in his most recent work, A Theory of Justice. And his lineage goes back through people like Immanuel Kant as well, very much a formalist tradition.
Yes, there are some Christian theologists who would like to subsume morality under the broad heading of theology. And I suspect that this might be the position of someone by the name of James Gustafson.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
not referring to his arguments, I suppose he might want to say that, in fact, when you are at the topmost level of moral reasoning, for example, when you have arrived at the judgment that respect for persons is the ultimate or absolute value, or
Yes.
justice is the ultimate value, the question that arises is, well, how do you justify such an absolute value? Now, the theologist might want to say, well, this is where the idea of religion comes in, or the idea of a supreme God comes in. So that in that sense, it might be said that, well, ultimately, reasoning or moral reasoning or morality will have to be underwritten by theological beliefs, and beyond that, you cannot have anything more.
See, I'm always puzzled by that. Let me say so sharply, and then I'll step back from the sharpness of it, that the seeming need for that is probably the product of sort of cultural conditioning. That is, if we were brought up to believe that there has to be some underwriting of such a scheme, and when it doesn't seem to be there, we feel there's a deficiency. And to be very callous about it, I'd recommend getting up out of the other side of bed tomorrow, and just seeing if the world feels different on the other side of the bed, and say, well, maybe, and start out with the presumption that one doesn't need such an underwriting. Now, does anything fall apart? What falls apart? That would be, I mean, that's being glib, for certain. Yet I think glib with a point. In any case, what kind of justification is it, and how would one know that it was a firm justification, to rely on the Godhead to underwrite the system? I mean, where does this leave the person who is outside theology, and some theologians might be content just simply to say outside theology and out in the wilderness, but I'm not content with that. Second of all, how do we know that God is underwriting it? Granted, God, how do we know, and indeed involves kind of epistemology to know that God, when God is speaking directly and clearly to you, presumably in English or in some language that you understand, but how do we know when God is speaking correctly and when the message has been corrupted? One could reach into Descartes and say, and how do I know that it isn't the devil tempting me? I mean, the devil surely is powerful enough to imitate. I mean, there are problems of what kind of access you have to God. And in any case, it's not clear, since the concept of justification rests within the parameters of the discussion of rationality, how that appeal is a justification. I mean, what sense of justification is that? I mean, at least it's another sense of justification from the kinds of justifications you offer going up the ladder. I mean, you appeal to higher levels of rationality, including comprehensiveness and internal coherence and parsimony of explanatory hypothesis. And we understand that inside the tradition of rationality. And then we say at the very last, we jump to God as underwriting it. Let me make
All right. If I could just interject,
I probably
because
need
there's a whole range of problems, of course,
yes,
that you raise there. But just to point out that within the Christian tradition, for example, there have been, I think ever since New Testament days, really two strains of tradition in the matter of the relationship between ethics to the general religious aspirations of people. And one, I think, is the one that you tend to be coming down hard on, and that is the view that the judgment about what is right and wrong that human beings make ultimately must have a grounding in a divine revelation. That is, God has revealed that this is right and wrong. There's a considerably, at least as extensive tradition that raises the whole question, going back to where we started our discussion, on how to get along in the world is a problem that's posed to human reason. And the whole ethical realm of ethical speculation that ran up through what emerged in the Middle Ages with the Aristotelians, St. Thomas Aquinas, in particular, picking up the ancient Greek tradition, where is very clear that human reason has a necessary part in even the criticism of human reason. Yes. In its own ethical judgments is a necessary activity for human beings to make. And that is a long way from the judgment, the initial judgment that it's right to do good and wrong to do evil, down to saying, what shall I do in this particular case? And what one does basically is construct reasons for saying, I aspire to the good, and then saying it's to be embodied in this particular action that I have facing me.
Well, I have no difficulty with lose the hinge of where God is required.
Well, I think the hinge is, again, where you related morality and religion. That is, there are larger dimensions to human life than simply those that take place between conception and death.
Yes.
And it's those larger dimensions in which this lifespan has to which this lifespan has a continuity. I mean, that's the fundamental religious judgment, that life is more than it appears.
Yes, in conjunction with that, may I cite that my agreement with Don that perhaps sometimes we are tempted again to think in terms of a quest for certainty, and presumably in our thinking now we would not want to do that, to go into that quest again. Now, the problem, however, is something like this. Suppose you were reasoning morally with a person, and ultimately in your reasoning together, you arrive at your judgment that, well, here we are. We have to do these kinds of things because they're entailed by the principle of, or the doctrine of, respect for persons. And the individual says, no, I just won't buy that. I'll live my own life. Now, the question is, well, how do you deal with such a person? Can we say, well, I just give up? It's up to you. Might it not be appropriate for a religious person, for example, to say, well, but look, there's something else in life other than just your wanting to live the kind of life you want to live. That there are certain other imponderables, certain other dimensions of life, religious dimensions, and certain religious doctrines that you have to take into account. And that's the only way by which you can account for your respect for persons.
All right. I take it that the person could also, you're having expounded the doctrine, opt out of those too. I mean, the problem isn't just the problem of the moral educator facing a student who says, and so what's so important about respect for persons? He could equally say, and so what's so important about various kinds of purity, or consonance with God, or harmony with the universe? I mean, the shoulder shrugging can go on in both domains. So I don't feel that that's a special problem that morality has, but there's still much more to your question than that. With respect to a person who, I take it that moral education, in the sense in which I have advanced it, has to do with the transmission of and the securing of adherence to, and much could be said about how that adherence might be secured in the different methods. The transmission of and the securing of adherence to certain principles that define what it is to be rational in interpersonal relations. Now, if a person shrugs his shoulders and says, well, I'm just not for being, I can see that would be rational, as in non-arbitrary, but I'm just not for it. And then you say, well, what do you do with such a person? If that's the way in which your example might be understood, then I'd want to say the problem isn't also moralities, it's also the problem of sciences. I mean, supposing you said, look, here's a whole lot of evidence. We've conducted these experiments many times, and there's a high reliability. These consequences just keep happening. Don't you think you should believe this? And he just shrugs his shoulders and says, I'm for astrology. I'm for reading tea leaves. We say, well, he's just stepped outside the rational domain. And then the question is it possible to argue someone into the rational domain given that they insist on standing outside its most fundamental principles? I mean, it seems to me that rationality only starts to take hold when certain conditions exist in the person. And if there's no traction in that person, then there's no way you argue the person in. I mean, that's sort of almost true by definition.
Are you suggesting, Dan, that when you enter into the religious dimension, that irrationality begins?
No, but there might be. I mean, the two are not in opposition, and I think certainly the best of one's theologians would hold that. Of course, that just may be a marvelous judgment that prefers on my behalf whom I might count as the best theologians. But there might be at least an element of the non-rational, which isn't to say the irrational, in all religion, and it might be best to admit it and to rejoice in it and to celebrate it. It seems to me that that's the way I'd certainly want to go with religion. And let me just add that though it may not appear so, I have a considerable interest in, personally as well as philosophically, exploring a religious dimension to my life and the lives of others. I think I only wanted to make the point that there may be an autonomous mode of understanding called moral understanding that need not necessarily rest upon religious premises. And that isn't to say, though, that religious premises don't have their purpose and their point and their validity. And then to go on to say that there may well be an element of the non-rational, a recognition of the mysteriousness in the very best of religion, and one might say also in the very best of psychology too. Not necessarily the Freudian model, but more the Jungian model. So I would call for the exaltation of the non-rational in religious experience.
Without making, I assume from what you said, some type of dichotomy between the rational and the non-rational within, for example, the actual lived religious context.
Yes.
Would you say the same with reference to morality, though? Isn't
For
there
example,
a non-rational aspect
For
to
example.
morality?
Would it rest in the notion of an ultimate assumption again, or a certain ultimate commitment? I'm wondering if the notion of non-rationality here is related to a belief that we're dealing with fundamental assumptions, and in calling them fundamental, we're saying that you can't justify them by appealing to something more fundamental.
Provided that you were going to extend that to all other forms of understanding.
Yes.
So the
yes,
scientific,
and,
for example. I mean, Aristotle
yes.
had this problem of what you do with first principles. Well, by definition, if they're first principles, there's not something resting behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's non-rational, it may be different, though, in the sense of non-rational. There may be two different senses of non-rational and religious. One is that there are certain fundamental principles which, as in science, can't be justified. But there might also be, and we might speak of a non-rational part of one's psyche to which, quite properly, a person responds to liturgy, for example, ritual, observance, those kinds of things, where the mysterious and the non-rational is within oneself, as distinct from speaking about principles for which there is nothing behind them to justify them. So there may be two senses of non-rational, and it might be important, if that could be sustained, not to confuse the two.
Mm-hmm.
Have we also shifted the meaning of religion in this discussion a long way from where it was when we began? We started talking about a denominational context, and we started talking about a belief in God, and now it seems as though religion's being taken very much more widely, almost so widely that you would want to say that even the atheist, who perhaps has some ultimate concerns, nevertheless counts as religious. Have we made that shift in the argument as we went along?
Well, I don't know that it was a shift in the argument. I mean, I did it fairly clearly and wouldn't apologize for having done it. I would like to hear from representatives, and I hope during the conference I will, of the denominational approach to values transmission, and how, for example, they would advocate that values should be transmitted, whether or not they would concede that modes of indoctrination are going on in classrooms. We'd have to be clear about the notion of indoctrination, what sort of rational inquiry is permitted, what sort of presuppositions are for which there's encouragement to question, that sort of thing. Or whether they just, whether they might well acknowledge that indeed that's what is going on and there is a justification for indoctrination. I really don't want to speak on their behalf. I'll be looking forward to them speaking, I'm sure, quite forcefully for themselves.
You do raise the question, though, or at least the problem of how whatever comes under the name moral education can be carried on in a school setting. And I believe you're just now referring to indoctrination. Earlier, I think you mentioned inculcation, which I guess would be about the same. You mentioned the use of developmental model associated with Kohlberg. Could you elaborate on, however, let's say, no more than 3? Or what is the process of moral education as you envision it?
Well, there
within
are,
a school
first
setting?
of all, competing models. Or at least they've been seen to compete, but they may very well be, once one's bearings are well founded, task for philosophy, they may well turn out to be complementary. But there are several that I could mention. Clearly the Kohlbergian model is the one that has attracted the most attention, for reasons that left-wing critics claim are cultural. This is a method which, or not a method, a model of viewing moral development and education along cognitive lines. It's concerned to map out and set in sequence levels of judgment, which Kohlberg claims all people go through, and in order, without regression. And if one is in one stage, say stage 3, one judges all topics within what he calls that's the structured whole that characterizes stage 3. So there the emphasis is on cognitive development. But there are other models. One that's somewhat more out of fashion is a behaviorist model, where there's a concern to develop right habits, for which you set up elaborate reinforcement schedules so that people are motivated to, perhaps extrinsically at first, but hopefully later on they internalize these responses.
Is this the kind of thing associated with Skinner, for example?
Well, he would be the theoretical architect of this. Then there are those who claim that you can teach moral reasoning, possibly Scriven, and what's called the Mukes approach, rather more directly than Kohlberg would claim. And you can teach people, for example, to identify value premises, factual cases, to make them more alert to the need to test, for example, for the truth of things that are claimed to be factual. You set up practical syllogisms, you go through workbooks, and that is a mode of or a contribution to moral education. More interesting, I think, in many ways, and so far not so well known, is the work of someone like Martin Hoffman, work, I think, which is quite brilliant, conceptually as well as experimentally, where he and his colleagues have been trying to look at the conditions which nurture such, let's put it crudely, affective dimensions as empathy and sympathy, generosity, altruism. They have looked at techniques by which, or styles of people being parents, and other styles, contrasting styles, to see what the upshot of these styles is. And then they've tried to apply this in classroom settings as well. And if you believe that the development of the capacities of sympathy and empathy and generosity and so on are important for the morally autonomous agent, then Hoffman's work warrants, it seems to me, very careful attention. He's been very careful in his work, very thorough, and not flashy with it, and has not tried to introduce it very quickly. He regards himself more as a researcher than a pedagogue. And so one has to draw inferences very, very carefully. But those would be 3 or 4 different approaches. I suppose I have, and it may well have been a Freudian oversight, refused to acknowledge in the list the values clarification approach. Ironically, probably the most prevalent, certainly my investigations in Canada among the ministries of public instruction would indicate that the values clarification approach is the one that they're prepared to introduce, if ever so slightly. It's almost as if they regard it as reasonably harmless, but that if they go through the motions of having students clarify their values, a la Simons and Roth's, that they sort of absolve themselves of responsibility to moral education, and then, said I cynically, the hidden curriculum can go on its merry way, fashioning students to conform rather tightly to Canadian norms. I think most of what goes on in our schools might be regarded as values socialization to make sure that people are rather well adjusted to the Canadian way of life, and that moral education, in the ways in which I would try to advance it, is relatively rare. Certainly there, in the course of my research anyway, instances of what I would regard as bona fide moral education are extremely rare. I might say, and provocative too, and that's one of the reasons why they're rare. Moral education is a political loser for politicians, simply because people might, if you're successful, come to question certain of the norms that your society takes to be a bedrock. And parents are very quick to, never mind whether or not there's been an advance in their child's capacity to rationally assess, that the child is no longer sharing as fully the commitments of parents. And this is a political nightmare for people who are, it's a nightmare for me too, who, someone like myself who would try to introduce as responsibly as possible moral education. It's something we would always have to look forward to in fear. I don't think you'd sleep very well at night for a while. Unless you had taken parents into your confidence, and this would be part of the strategy, and I don't mean manipulation, to explain to them what you were trying to do and secure their adherence and indicate that there might be moments of transition that might cause them grave concern, but that if they share your view that the morally autonomous agent is, among other things, a good thing to produce, that there might well be discrepancies between their judgments and their children's judgments, but that's part of education. If they subscribe to that, then maybe you've offset a possible frightened reaction to your enterprise.
I'm wondering if we could say at this point then that we'd started with perhaps a view that religion and morality, for some sociological reason, have tended to be associated in people's minds, that we've moved from there to a discussion in terms of how both of these as forms of understanding seem to lead back to some rather ultimate commitments, and tried to relate that in turn to perhaps 4 different approaches to moral education up to this point. And perhaps if we have accomplished that much in the last half hour or so, the appropriate thing to do might be to thank Professor Cochrane for the time that he's taken to help us clarify these issues, and also Professor Shuell and Professor Magsino for their questions.